If you can't tell, I'm just doing these throughout my whole Sunday, so I just worked out. Now I'm back. More videos. Last video for evolution. Again, macroevolution. So this is like the biggest picture. When we talk about the idea that there's the Big Bang, created the universe, there's this explosion of material that created planets, etc., etc. Um, that's all you really need to know about, right? That the first things that existed were elements. Um, and it created the universe and all of this stuff. Our sun was formed about 5 billion years ago, and our universe was clouds of dust and large space rocks. Um, the gravitational pull of asteroids colliding created planets. Earth was created about 4.6 billion years ago. Even after that, it was basically just carbon dioxide gas, hydrogen, nitrogen, very little oxygen, um, and there's no rust or oxidation because there was no oxygen. When we look at very, very big picture evolution, we use radioactive decay to determine the age of certain things. We usually look at the isotope carbon 14, which decays at a certain pace. And so we know based on the number of carbon 14 left that we can determine how old something is. This is the predicted steps in the origin of life. When we think back to when we were doing cell bio, we already talked about this, right? The symbiosis and the eating of another cell to make multicellular organisms. But we start inorganic molecules, monomers, polymers, into like a very simple cell, into like DNA-based cells. If we skip ahead, you know the Miller-Urey experiment, right? Here we go. He combined methane gas, nitrogen, hydrogen, sent electricity through it like you would with a lightning, and eventually cooled it, had it like rain, went through some water, and eventually he found that organic compounds, carbon and oxygen, were starting to be made. And we know that carbon is necessary for us to make cells and RNA, and it made proteins as well. Um, and so that is kind of the biggest Miller-Urey experiment. You need to know that. Synthesis of small organic molecules. This kind of goes into it a little bit more detail. But essentially, we have all of my inorganic molecules making my organic molecules like carbon and things like that. And then I need to start making polymers, which are long chains. Um, it's been shown that if amino acids were dropped onto a clay surface that is hot, they would start to bond, utilizing the heat from the clay. They predict this is how we made the first cell membranes, the first like lipids, the first proteins. Um, and then they found that very slowly, very simple cell structures could do some sort of metabolic reaction to make energy. The very first cells, we call them protocells, and they only had RNA, which is a much simpler form of DNA. Um, Basically, a protocell was a lipid membrane, a little bit of RNA, and the RNA could be read to make certain things. And eventually, maybe they could start like processing things and doing metabolic things. Um, Again, the first genetic material is believed to be RNA. RNA can self-replicate. It is a lot stronger than DNA. It can make enzymes and things like that. Um, so that's what we believe. When did life begin? Life began about 3.9 billion years ago. The Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago. The earliest fossil that we've seen is 3.5 billion, but they predicted that there was some stuff going on at 3.9 billion years ago. Obviously, we see prokaryotes first for all of the reasons you would assume. Um, they were probably anaerobic at this point and very tiny, living in very harsh environments. What is the consequence of oxygen being made around 2.7 billion years ago. We see that my anaerobic organisms start to fail. My aerobic organisms are going to be like much more supported. So things start making ATP also. When we start looking at like how organisms started and putting them into compartments, it allows us to, when we start seeing compartmentalization from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, it allows us to put certain functions in certain spaces. My mitochondria, there's one thing going on in there, and my nucleus, there's one thing going on in there, and so it allows us to separate those functions. The endosymbiosis hypothesis, this is how we get from prokaryotes to our very first simple eukaryote. Look back to the cell bio if you don't remember this. It's why mitochondria have a double membrane, stuff like that. This talks about it more. Evidence for it, double membrane, being able to produce their own energy, having their own DNA within like mitochondria and stuff like that. Right, we've talked about this a lot. Eventually, the next milestone after becoming a eukaryotic cell would be sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction ensures like variability in genetics. They can evolve more rapidly. So this gives the organisms who can do this an evolutionary advantage. Then we start seeing multicellular eukaryotes. It's usually algae are the first things to evolve. I think that's pretty much it. The Cambrian explosion. So now we're into the millions, and we have multicellular organisms. In the Cambrian era, we see a huge explosion of sponges, cnidarians, echinoderms, chondrates, mollusks, basically all of the classes of organisms. Around right after that era, after multicellular organisms form, we see organisms start moving to the land. Only plants at this point. We see a vascular system developing to carry water, and all sorts of adaptations to be on land. We also see like the simple organisms after plants move coming up to land as well. Also having adaptations that allow them to survive out of the water. Changes in the earth that allow for this evolution to occur. Obviously, Pangea and the separation of Pangea is going to separate organisms, and we know geographic separation is going to make different species. Continental drift is the thing that caused Pangea to separate. Also, large things that will create extinctions will change the genetic makeup of the organisms. We saw a lot more of those a long time ago. The Cretaceous mass extinction is the extinction of the dinosaurs. They believe it meteor hit. We also see the Great Oxygen Catastrophe about 2.4 billion years ago, which for whatever reason there was a huge dip in oxygen. We also see that like during periods where there's lots of glacial formation, there's not a lot of oxygen because plants die off. This is a kind of quick and dirty look at all of the eras, but you don't need to know this for the AP biology. It's not worth memorizing. And that is it for evolution.